Yeah, this issue is so timely that they decided to start by letting an 18th century historian speak. Um, but I hope I'll convince you that there is actually something very timely about history and how we think about and use the past. Oh, there's my monitor. Okay, good. So in the little ahead of myself. In the distantly remembered past of the 2008 U.S. presidential election campaign, Barack Obama was embroiled in a fierce media storm about his former pastor, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, and he gave what became a pretty serious landmark speech, often known as the race speech. And the speech begins by invoking the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which in and of itself isn't actually particularly unusual or surprising. Politicians summon the founders pretty much every day to support their views or policies. But Obama's narrative then took a fairly surprising turn. Rather than glorify, Obama used this opening to discuss the divergence between the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, as he phrased it, and on the one hand, and the legacy of slavery in the United States on the other. And in this speech, he quotes Faulkner's famous line, actually incorrectly, from Faulkner's not so well-known book. It's probably one of his most famous lines, but from one of his lesser-known books, Requiem for a Nun. And this widely quoted line is used by Obama to argue that we have to understand that the historic causes of America's racial divisions, we have to understand the historic causes of America's racial divisions in order to move forward and create a more perfect union, which is actually the title for his speech, and of course the sort of preamble of the Constitution. And the quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," is particularly useful when thinking about the role that history often plays in public and political culture. As Obama said, quote, "Understanding this reality requires a reminder of how we arrived at this point." Now, history is a very much a useful tool for politicians and others trying to create a convincing narrative, but it is often misused and distorted to further a political agenda or and a policy agenda. All kinds of agendas are sort of history is used to support all sorts of things, and we've seen in recent times an escalation of this kind of misuse. Historians are particularly equipped to critique such claims, but I think doing so in ways that are sort of productive and appeal to a broad audience is easier said than done. And in fact, when we had our kind of pre-conference call about the panel, David sort of asked us to talk about how we are thinking about reaching sort of the more marginalized audiences and those that are not as easily reached through the usual means. And I've thought about this a lot since then, especially when I was working on this talk. And I think to some extent that really is the big unsolved question of our current political and social climate. If I had the answer to that, I'd be a lot more wealthy than I am, I think. We've heard lots of punditry about how technological change, how the influence of social media has created an environment where we are more likely to see and hear things that reflect our own ideological preferences rather than the breadth of ideas that are out there in our society. But very few solutions to this problem have been presented. And I do think that scholarly societies, whatever their disciplinary foci, can encourage scholars to communicate with general audiences, to build channels for careers in policy and other areas that promote understanding, and work toward new professional credit protocols. This is something we've been working on a lot at the American Historical Association, and to really challenge attacks on knowledge and science and also this kind of misinformation that is so prevalent in our society today. But I want to make a point. I'm going to go on to talk about the ways in which the AHA is doing a lot of this work in a variety of arenas. But I kind of want to remind us that we need to be thinking about the classroom. As a scholarly society, and in many scholarly societies, a lot of our members interact with broad publics every single day in the classroom. And we talk about trying to reach out to broader publics, but actually, those broad publics are in front of a lot of our members. And I think this is vital. Most adults have a high school diploma, and around 30% have a college degree. So the importance of teaching and the importance of that particular interaction shouldn't be underestimated. But at the same time, we need to be finding ways to improve teaching and expand the work of scholars and researchers beyond the classroom. And I think this is another area in which societies can play an important role. But again, there are challenges. Scholars primarily write for and speak to other scholars and students. They rarely publish in places that have audiences beyond the academy or beyond their particular constituency. And training in such writing and speaking is not a routine part of graduate education. So given all of what I've said so far, how do we at the AHA encourage our members and historians to bring historical knowledge to bear on contemporary issues that are a particular concern to our society? Our work on these questions falls into three main categories: advocacy, education and training, and outreach and engagement. So starting with advocacy, at the AHA in particular, much of our advocacy work is done through the National History Center, which is an arm of the AHA that exists to, as we put it on the website, reinforce the critical role that history and historical knowledge play in public decision-making and civic life. And one of the NHC's main programs is a series of congressional briefings where we bring historians to Capitol Hill to provide members of Congress and their staff with the historical background needed to understand the context of current legislative concerns. So recent briefings have covered topics including US-China relations, the history of executive orders, drug policy and drug addiction, and last year we held them on mass incarceration when that became a particular issue that was a focus for the administration, Zika and public health when that was in the news, and even the topics such as political partisanship, which of course is particularly relevant at the moment. The AHA also regularly, and we've been doing this with even greater regularity, and the amount of time it takes up in the staff, among the staff and our governing bodies is quite astonishing. We issue statements that bring historical perspectives to bear on policies or legislation. Sometimes these are specifically about education policy or higher education policy, but they are also about, sort of bigger issues such as the executive order that restricted entry to the US. We issued a statement that related the order to previous instances of banning travel, and also to the larger history of immigration to the US. The statement also talked about the deleterious effect of restricting travel on the free exchange of ideas. And so we're very careful when we issue these statements to make sure that we're focusing on the mission of the organization and focusing on what our real mission is, supporting higher education, supporting historical knowledge, and using the knowledge that our members as historians have to sort of critique policy, which I think is really important. When associations start going away from their mission, that's when things get problematic. But focusing on your mission and using your mission and your members and the knowledge of your members to when making these kind of public statements is vital. We also actually work directly to engage in policymaking where it's relevant, and this is usually on education policy. Earlier this year, AHA members participated in hearings before the Texas State Board of Education over a proposed textbook on Mexican-American history that was full of falsehoods and errors. And as a result of this work, the board actually denied the adoption of this book in Texas's high schools, and it was a real victory. Moving on now to education. Another important aspect of AHA activity in trying to build public engagement and inspire members is education and training. And mostly here I'm talking about the ways in which we're educating historians and graduate education. And we do this in small and big ways. We've held sessions at our annual meeting on writing for general audiences. We've held debates on the roles of historians and academics in public life, and also provided media training sessions. And in larger ways, one of our major projects and programs at the moment is this Career Diversity for Historians, which is about providing breadth in graduate education. And it isn't specifically focused on public engagement, but that is an important part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to explore the culture and practice of graduate education and working to ensure that it includes a broad set of skills that enable historians to be good communicators both within and outside the academy. And finally, moving on to outreach, we have we work pretty hard to encourage public engagement by our members and historians more broadly, where, and again, historical knowledge and thinking can be brought to bear on contemporary issues. Our blog regularly publishes pieces by historians that engage with contemporary issues. We have a growing section of our website called Historians Making News, where we publish when historians highlight, when historians publish in venues such as newspapers, when they do op-eds, we'll do a blurb and provide a link, and we've been doing more and more of this. And I also want to point out that this isn't just about writing on national issues for newspapers like the New York Times or Washington Post, but also includes encouragement to engage at the local level. Historians live and work all over the country and are, involved in discussions and providing historical perspective on things that are more local issues. And I think that's really important as well. And just to conclude, so this is just a few of the examples of the various ways in which the association works to bring history to bear on public culture. So to conclude, I'm going to bring us back full circle and make like Barack Obama in invoking the founders, but of course to a different end. In 1822, James Madison wrote a letter, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to farce or tragedy, or perhaps both. A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. Like many of his contemporaries, Madison understood the importance of an educated electorate. Scholarly societies, as communities of citizens with particular kinds of expertise, have an obligation to help encourage that vital exchange of knowledge as a foundation for participation in civic culture that encourages informed democratic decision-making. Thank you.